Now I'd like to welcome Mr. Jim Herlihy, a Cork man living in Dublin. He has written 3 books on the RIC and 2 on the Dublin Metropolitan Police. His 3 on the RIC include a history of the force, a full list of all RIC members from the beginning, and a biographical dictionary of those members. So I'm going to hand over now to Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, hope you can all hear me. George Bernard Shaw said the danger of tracing your ancestors is that you might find one hanging from a branch, either by his neck or by his tail. Now, and the question is, you can't choose who your ancestors were, and the question is, would they have chosen you? Genealogy, I'm interested in the genealogy side of it. No extra grind, who did what, or anything with the independence. I'm very anxious to see those who died as a result of political violence, or the ordinary men who died, that they would be remembered. And we have a new organisation just started by 2 ex-members of the Garda Síochána, who I've no doubt will fulfil the role before we have the centenary of 1922. And I'm delighted to hear that. What I want to try and get across is how I got interested in the RIC, the personalities that were in the RIC, a brief potted history, and I hope to end on some of very unusual personalities. You'll be surprised who has connections with the RIC. And as late as yesterday, I had a phone call from the wife of the Chief Justice of the United States, the man who swore in Obama. Her great-grandfather was a William Carroll. I just got his record yesterday, from Tipperary, North Riding, born in 1846. That'll tell you just how many are out there. Just take it, 85,028 people passed through the RIC between 1816 and 1922. Each of them had to have 2 parents. That's 250,000 people with descendants. And believe me, RIC men didn't have small families. And one example I can give you, if they hadn't sons in the RIC, they all mixed in the same grouping. Daughters married RIC men, even if the sons didn't marry. One example was last week, I went up to Castlereagh, County Roscommon in Ballinlough, tracing an RIC man to a station above there. The family in New York just thought there was only just 1 member of the family that emigrated to the States. I found 13 in the family. 7 of the godfathers of the children were RIC men. And you were able to trace those coming through the record, stationed above there and moving on again. That's just only a typical example. But my interest begins with my father. My father was 75 when I was born, and he was 79 when my brother was born. I just hope it's hereditary. And my father emigrated to Boston in 1898 with 5 sisters and a brother. Their aunt married the mayor of Boston at the time, James Michael Curley. I know of 112 cousins in the state of Massachusetts. Incidentally, they all got jobs. I just wonder why things haven't changed. My father taken in 1915. He came back in 1915 and joined the British Army. And believe it or not, I got a photograph of him in the Cork Examiner when I was looking up some other research. And he was in the Royal Field Artillery, and the cap badge, he left me his papers, cap badge, and a box full of some of these mementos. He was a tailor by occupation. His biggest claim to fame in the States was he sewed the buttons in the waistcoat of the then President, William Howard Taft. And Taft was so big, and his waistcoat was so big, that his brother also claimed the same fame. And in order the 2 of them could say they did it, they picked every second button. Now, Taft was so big, someone told me recently that when he got up, 2 women sat down. This is my father's discharge papers, and years ago when I started research first, it was just by communication, letters and talking to people, but now the internet has really opened up things. I've got the card index for his medals, only I have had it a while, but the other day my father was invalided back to France. I always thought back to Liverpool, but it's now Newcastle. He had this wound badge that they wore, they could wear in the uniform afterwards, and the number on that, you can trace it online. These are his 3 First World War medals. Now, my interest in medals stems also, it's a great way of tracing auxiliaries and black and tans, because by their medal bars, even though you can't see them in colour, you can see the lining that's on them, but especially bravery medals. Some bravery medals were allocated to non-commissioned officers and commissioned officers. And if you take the black and tans were ex-non-commissioned officers. The auxiliaries were ex-commissioned officers. But they became commissioned officers because they rose through the ranks. And they have a combination of medals that were issued to both non-commissioned and commissioned, like the military medal and the military cross. If they have a combination, you know that they came from the ranks. And these are some just little mementos from the First World War. The wound stripe there on the left-hand side, if you went back into uniform after being wounded, you could wear that on your uniform, your stripes. It just shows how many times you were wounded. The little silver badge which can be traced is a badge they wore because the women at the time, if a fellow was called a cord, used to wave white feathers at them. And if you wore one of these badges, you were considered okay. That's the one on the right is a bit more of a fancier badge, but not numbered. And again, this is a penny made in the trenches, 1914 penny. Another penny wrapped around it, what they call trench art. And it's a pea cap made out of when they were idle in the trenches. My father was a tailor in Carrigadrohid in County Cork. And my first introduction to the RIC was in 1961, when my father brought me back to Carrigadrohid. He was a tailor there during the Troubles, as his father and his brother. And he was making uniforms for the RIC. And he showed me, he wouldn't have been suspect being in the station. And they were actually making a hole in the wall for the RIC to get out, knowing that an attack was imminent. Now, the lady who was in the station at the time has only died in the last 5 years. I have her on tape describing in great detail. And she gave me a list of RIC men that were in there at the time. So I set about trying to find out who was in the station. And to find those 5, I probably had to go through 500. And then eventually I went over to Public Records in Kew and got an idea what the records were. And that developed into a book. And then I tried to honour those who were killed on duty and those who went off to the First World War, and all these specialists started occurring. Then I got such a volume of correspondence of people saying to me, you haven't got my guy in the RIC. There was only 2,000 names in the back of this. There was 85,000 in the RIC. So, and there were 834 Murphys. Now, if you're doing a family tree, the RIC can be a huge asset because civil registration begins in this country on the 1st of January 1864. The RIC service records go back to 1816, which means that you can put a person in a time frame, you can say who recommended him, and that person usually would have to be known to him. This is another person my father made uniforms for. He's the man who shot Sheehy Skeffington in 1916 and lived in Carrigadrohid. And I've tracked him down, and believe it or not, that family still owns the castle. His daughter is living in Washington at the moment, and she came back. And the county council boarded up the place straight away on account of public liability. Someone outside the place owns it. That's him in retirement. I've got a huge album of photographs of him in retirement. He took off. He killed Sheehy Skeffington. He was jailed in Dartmoor. He got a pardon, and he got something like 90,000 acres in Canada. He was fluent in 7 languages. He met his wife in Japan, travelled all over the world. And this is another man I met, Lieutenant General Schrader in Carton D. Worth VC. My father, he won the Victoria Cross in World War I. And his stepson only died in the last year, the horse trainer, Fergie Sutherland. And he was wounded 15 times. He had 15 of these little stripes. My father said it was the best job he ever got, he said, because it was only half the material for twice the money. And we visited him at the time when I was 7, and my father wanted to go in the tradesman's entrance into the house, and Lady Duarte came out to us in the driveway. He lived in the Heenan in County Cork, just outside Carrigadrohid, retired there. And my father went to go in the tradesman's entrance. Lady Duarte said those days are long gone. It was my father's first day, 40 years on, going in the front door of the house. And we had high tea inside. My father was up speaking to the general. I got to shake hands with him. An amazing He's written a fantastic book which has recently been published called A Happy Odyssey. It's an incredible story. He's one of Churchill's generals in World War II. He was in the Boer War, World War I and World War II. And he had 21 decorations altogether. This is him on the right-hand side there after losing an arm and an eye. And with Churchill, Chankay-Chek, talking about heavy hitters. And I was on the radio talking about him on Joe Duffy there one day. And the day I was talking about it, that's the day Lady Duarte died. She was 104 years of age. A woman said, I nearly crashed my car. That time Joe Duffy was finished at 2:45. And she rang me straight away when it ended, and she says, I'm at Lady Duarte's funeral. Just coincidences. Now, this is the RIC station my father helped the RIC escape out of. And it's in Carrigadrohid. There's a list of architectural buildings around the country, and it names the RIC station. In fact, it names the building next door if you go looking at it. But that's the RIC station in 1920 it was attacked. This is a man who got the Constabulary Medal for defending the station, even though they got out the back door. The Daily Mirror has an account of it. the fiddler that beats Sinn Féin is on it, because there was one guy playing the fiddle inside, knowing about getting out the back door. I joined the Garda Síochána in 1977, and I retired earlier this year. And I came to Blarney, and by coincidence, Blarney Station was also attacked in June of 1920, the same time as Carrigadrohid. And I tried to find out who the last sergeant was. Eventually got a photograph of him, and eventually tracked down his daughter, brought her out to the station, walked her through the station, taped her, and they used that in Michael Collins' film, The Wynn, the Shicks, the Barley, to do out the inside the station, what they looked like in 1920. When the station was attacked in 1920, this is the IRA man who attacked the Frank Bustede. I met his family, and in 1965 he appeared back at the station, met a detective there, and he said, "You know, your clock was stolen in 1920 when it was the RIC station." He said, "I know where it is." So 2 days later he went away with the detective, they had a few pints, and back the clock arrived under his arm, and it was hanging in the station up to recently until the station caught fire again, so it has survived literally 2 attacks.
It was in a personal household?
In his house, he had it hidden. I spoke to his family, 2 daughters and his son were living in Scotland. They never knew where it was at all. The same man stole a Rolls Royce, the ghost car, and it was used in drive-by shootings by the IRA, bright yellow. That has been restored, and the 2 of us here, John Sheehan, a friend of mine, we were in that car only up to recently. It was restored, put into a bog. It was actually used in 1923 when they fired at British Army down in Cove. And it's been the same as, it's been done up, it's absolutely immaculate altogether. And it had the big, huge gun on the back of it, the drive-by shooting. This is, when I was looking for information on further RIC and trying to get some stories, I got a phone call from this lady. She says, "I have a live one for you." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "My grandfather was in the RIC and he's living out in Killester." So I went up and I spoke to him, and I was expecting to see a guy in oxygen, 99 years of age. He came out in his pinstripe suit, his RIC cane. The family deserted the house, and they said, "Thanks be to God, someone's listening to a story." He was stationed at Drum in Wicklow, and 2.5 hours later, I ran out of tape talking to him. But I learned 2 very distinct things about him, which was great help in tracing your ancestors afterwards. You had to be 19 to join, or 5'9". But if your father was in it, you got a year off the age and an inch off the height. And he says, "I know," he says, "I got in under both counts." Now, and it being a family affair, he had 3 brothers in it, his father was in it, and his father-in-law was in it. He had Dan Breen's description as a blacksmith, off by heart even to that day. Very well read, showed me all the books he read and everything. And I got a great insight on as many regulations, internal regulations as the RIC made about their members. They found a way around it. There was always a way around it. Even fellas getting married and moving to England, not reporting the marriage, there's ways. You couldn't be stationed in your home county or your wife's county. Worse still, you had to have 7-year service before you could get married. But you had to, I've only found out recently, you had to declare your intention after 5 years. So she was what they call in the RIC a lady in waiting for 2 years. So he worked in the Michael Collins film. We got to describe the station, this type of thing. And the first thing he says to me, when the arts people were looking to do up a station down, and we went up, he was gone on holidays down in Athlone, we had to go down looking for him. And he said, "Where are the guns going to be?" And I said, "They're going to be inside the door." He said, "We weren't that stupid," he said. They had a gun in every room, that they'd retreat into a room. They were armed no matter what happened, no matter who came into the station. This is a man who keeps following me around the place, Tobias O'Sullivan. He was wounded in Kilmallock. Bullet ricocheted off his notebook. He was promoted, made a district inspector, and he was in Listowel walking along the street with his young child, and he was riddled to death. I eventually, and one of those kids is in that photograph. One of those kids ended up in Texas, and there were papers in Trinity College by a son of an RIC man who was doing a history of it at the time, letters from him, and he said, let Ireland sort out her own problems. He didn't want to hear anymore. But of my cousins that went to state, one of my first cousins in the state was married to a Sullivan. And anytime the Yanks came home in the 60s, they photographed us. I knew they were coming because we get coffee, we get ham, and you get brill cream and a haircut. And they'd open up the packages of the clothes that we got from America, and they'd photograph us. And all those photographs end up in America. But the Sullivans, who came home from Boston, were going up to Cornamona afterwards, and they were always talking about the film The Quiet Man. The Sullivans above there, they owned the bishop's car that you see in the very end of it. And it's, believe it or not, it's still in the garage up there in the place. So, but one of that family is Tobias O'Sullivan, and he had 3 brothers in the RIC. And so those Sullivans are indirectly related to me. Now, when I was writing the officer's book, I was trying to track down every officer, and I found the grave, and I just put a flower on it on the left-hand side. And to my astonishment, I came back a year later, someone had arrived and had done it up. I also have on film his funeral with the Auxiliaries doing the Guard of Honour, and 3 of his brothers coming back from the colonies, all police officers. And it's near where the quiet man is, and I actually slept, believe it or not, in Maureen O'Hara's bed. But it was about 50 years on. One of my cousins on the Maureen O'Hara side owns the house in Churchtown Road where Maureen O'Hara lived, and they're connected. So the story, the Sullivan and O'Sullivan, but it keeps on haunting me anyway. Now, just getting into the history of the RIC briefly, you had the Baronial Constabulary from 1787 up to 1882. I'll explain in greater detail, just an overview. Then you had the Peace Preservation Force from 1814. It overlapped in some parts of the country up to 1836, but not utilised as such. And the Irish Constabulary from 1836 up to 1867. It was the Irish Constabulary. Then it got the Royal prefix from 1867 for suppressing the Fenian Rising. And you had, before that, you had the County Constabulary from 1822 to 36. Now, just other police forces. The Royal Irish Constabulary were for the 32 counties of Ireland, with the exception of Dublin, and the Dublin police force was unarmed. There was 12,556 DMP men passed through the system between 1836 and 1925. And unlike the RIC being disbanded in 1922, they continued until 1925. And the Dublin Metropolitan Police became the division, the DMD, Dublin Metropolitan Division of the Garda Síochána in 1925. You had the old Dublin Police from 1786 to 1836, then the DMP. You had the Irish Revenue Police. They were known as the Poitín Hussars. Over 2,000 policemen chasing poitín makers. And they were there from 1832 up to 1857. And in the last few years, I found their headquarters and their training depot in Dublin. And you won't believe where it is. It's the red building in the Bishop's Palace. And we actually checked it against the census and the buildings. And down to dimensions, the ceilings have been dropped down, but they're a very interesting bunch. Now, the reason how they came about was that there was a loss of revenue, obviously, and every parish priest and vicar in the country was sent a letter, have you a problem with poitín making in the country? All those west of the Shannon said yes, and they ended up with revenue police stations, and they had raiding parties for the rest of the country. They were amalgamated with the Irish Constabulary in 1857, and I have a complete list of who transferred over. But from a genealogical point of view, you have 2 dates of joining. You have the date they joined Revenue Police and the date they transfer over. So it's another way of indirectly finding your way into Revenue Police by those ones who transferred over on the 1st of October 1857. In Dublin, you had the Belfast City Police. They were amalgamated with the RIC in 1865. You had the Derry City Police, called the Bang Beggars or the Horny Dicks. I don't know why they got their name, but they were there from 1832 to 1870, and the RIC took over their role again. Now, you had the first version of Black and Tans, and it is the blueprint for the Black and Tans, I'm absolutely convinced, called the Royal Irish Constabulary Auxiliary Force. They had the RIC AF. Unlike the RIC afterwards, the Auxiliaries, the ADRIC. And they were made up when they came under severe pressure during the land wars. They needed trained, those used in our ex-military men, trained in the use of firearms to relieve the ordinary RIC, and that was their function, and they were in police huts, and the RIC went about their business. That was the intention also in 1920, but that the auxiliaries were to be the officer corps of the Black and Tans, but it didn't work out that way because the intelligence that they got completely dried up due to the pressure of the IRA. You had railway police and you had Irish Harbour Police. Michael Collins had his own police force called the Oriel House Detectives, and they operated out of Oriel House. They were disbanded, and some of them end up in the ordinary detective branch, or in detective branch in the Guards in 1925. When the treaty was signed, they needed to protect the members of Dáil Éireann, and then, of course, when the split came, you had half of Michael Collins' men looking after De Valera's men. That's the strange irony in it. And they came under fire. Some of them were killed on duty. In fact, the first public hanging in the Irish Free State as a result of 2 Oriel housemen being killed. The Cork City Police, or Cork Civic Patrol, that was formed in August 22 because the Free State troops hadn't got to Cork. Cork was still being held by the irregulars. So the business interests of Cork got together. Again, they got ex-army people just directing the traffic. And if you notice Michael Collins' funeral, look at the footage the next time. There are no guards in Cork. They didn't arrive there until November. But you get those standing at the side, like 2 photographs with CCP, Cork Civic Patrol or CCP. They are the police in Cork at the time. So a few of them ended up in the Garda Síochána. The man who was in charge of them at the time ended up as the chief superintendent in the guards. Then you had the civic guards, as they were called first, meeting at the Gresham Hotel, and the founding committee was half made up of ex-RIC officers. Now, only 180 RIC men transferred to the guards. And the reason being is that the RIC, if you were 12 years service at the time, you got 10 years onto your service, so you had a pension of 22 years service. And your pay brought you above the Garda pay. But what they did with most of them, they brought them in as specialists and trainers, and they promoted to the rank of sergeant. Now, another term was that when you got a pension from the RIC on disbandment, and if you left the country and joined another police force, your pension was suspended. But at the end of that service, you ended up with 2 pensions. Then the Civic Guards restarted the Garda Síochána in 1923, and then you have Royal Irish Constabulary founded on the 1st of June 1922, which becomes the Police Service of Northern Ireland. Now, just on the Baronial Constabulary, of no consequence whatsoever. You'll only get them in lists, but there's nothing really there about them. All you know about them is that they were all Protestants. And that's a mock-up done for the 150th anniversary of what they would look like. No detection of crime, it didn't seem to figure in their thing and all, just get paid and turn up. The Peace Preservation Force was brought in. It was compiled mainly of, between the period about 1812 and up to 1814, ex-Dublin police magistrates were sent down the country to see where the trouble spots were. And apparently Middletown and Tipperary seems to be the worst place, and they were to get the feeling on the ground. And then when the Peace Preservation Force, mainly cavalry sergeants, were sent into an area, they identified the problem inside there. The danger with them is that they wiped out more than a problem. A lot of innocent people got caught up. They had no, what do we call now, a local knowledge of the area. The area was proclaimed. The locals had to pay for them. And the arms and equipment were applied by the government. But it was in the locals' interest to get them out because it was costing them while they were there. Sir Richard Wilcox is one of those. He's buried outside in Chapel Izzet. His great-grandson, by coincidence, is an expert on peace and reconciliation. He's written several books. The Dalai Lama has, and Mother Teresa have actually done the forewords to some of his books, but it's just a huge coincidence. And this photograph he gave me of him. He has lots of correspondence with Robert Peel. I think some of it is there. That's where he's buried outside, and I found his grave out in... when the RIC was, this is another one of presented, a silver snuff box presented to him. This ended up in the Phoenix Park Depot, and every officer of the equivalent of modern day superintendent upwards, district inspectors, sub-inspectors, chief constables in the early stage they were called, would have taken snuff out of that from 1822 or 1842 when the depot opened up to 1922. And you'll find a lot of those early Peace Preservation Force officers are all buried out in Mount Jerome. I found one row of them, all buried one after the other, and very substantial monuments. The County Constabulary in 1822, when that was set up, the country was divided into 4 different regions and 4 separate training depots. And you had in Munster, Richard Wilcox, Thomas Darcy in Ulster, Thomas Powell in Leinster, and then you had Major Warburton in Connacht. And then you had 4 different train depots. The train depot in Cork was in Ballincollig. And the ranks that at that time were rank of superintendent, which became a sub-inspector in 1828, chief constable, head constable, and sub-constables. Now, the difficulty with that is that you had 4 distinct police forces with 4 separate types of training, 4 different types of uniform, and everything ended on their border, and there was nothing organised for the country, and Dublin Castle wanted to run everything uniformly. This is what the officers would have looked something like at the time from watercolour. This is Louis Anderson, one of those. The very early officers were ex-military, ex-British Army, Peninsula War officers, because they knew the training. You didn't have to retrain them in the use of firearms or anything like that. And this is what the ordinary constables would have been. Imagine him with a breathalyzer or anything like that. But, and it's a very rare description of them. Samson Tuggood Roach, the man who did those little miniatures, was deaf. And we got that only recently in Northern Ireland, but it's a fabulous description of them. It's one of the very rare ones. There's some of the correspondence I mentioned a while ago about Sir Richard Wilcox. There's some to Daniel O'Connell writing to Sir Richard Wilcox when he was in Munster, trying to get the parish priest nephew into the police at the time, so things really haven't changed that much. Because he sends a second letter saying how he gets this guy in, could you get the second guy in? So this is one of the officers. I was in the Garda Museum there one day when somebody arrived in with a painting just left to the museum, and I found it buried outside in, again in Mount Jerome. Sir John Herlihy, he ended up as a governor in Canada, and he was responsible for the founding of what we call the Terra Nova Constabulary first, which becomes the Newfoundland Constabulary, or the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, but just shows the Irish influence. Timothy Mitchell was brought over from Galway, and you can see there the buttons of them, Terra Nova on the right hand side, very similar to that's the badge that was put over stations in 1836. And this is what their uniform looks like today. If you had 5-year service, if you look down to the end, Blianta Shervisha 5. 20. They came over to us and we got them for their anniversary to parade above, and they wrote music, company music, to parade on the square above. An extraordinary event altogether. Their band at the moment, playing Irish music, their accents, you'd think you were from Waterford. And they played Irish music. Definitely they should have a concert here. Síochána, believe it or not, is the name of the band. And they were in the mess above there the whole night, and everybody coming in thought it was just only locals, took no notice of them at all. It's not Herlihy, by the way, in another life, but it's, as I said, the numbers go from 1 up to 85,000, 85,000, 83,000, but there's 1,700 of those are officers. And this is it's a later photograph of a person who was granted number 161. Now, anybody who's looked at the records will see that the very early records, the red book that I did, has the full 85,000 names in it. But what you see is the numbers jump at the very start up in chunks, and then they go, after 1836, they go slow. What actually happened was, they said in 1836, for the first time it becomes the Irish Constabulary, a national police force. Who have we now? So those who've left, they go back to the earliest fellow to join and give him number 1. And that's how you have it. But you get their service in it from the time that they did join in 1816. But those who would have died before 1836, you will not get. Now, some people have followed those, and eventually they've got great records because they've eventually picked them up in pensions and things. And they come in and they say, why isn't he in the red book? Because he was gone, guaranteed he was gone before 1836, but you will find him in pensions. That's the constabulary badge that was put up. As you see, most of the stations around the country, about 1,600 in all, they were whitewashed, and this badge was put up with the shamrock in the centre, with the garter around the side, with just constabulary on it. And it has the Victorian crown, which is the flat crown. The way of joining before October 18, you will not find a person, you'll find a person wearing 3 stripes in the RIC before October 1882, but you will not find him as a sergeant. And in the records, you'll either find him as a constable, because the way of joining before 1882 was you joined as a sub-constable, 2nd class. Now, if you kept your head down and your mouth shut for a year, you'll see that he becomes 1st class after a year. Then the next rank up was an acting constable, and he wore 2 chevrons on his lower sleeve here. And a constable then wears 3 stripes. Then you had head constables, 1st and 2nd class. Then sub-inspector, the equivalent of modern-day superintendent. Your county inspector, assistant inspector general, deputy, and Inspector Generals. The higher officers there, Assistant Inspector General and upwards, were all based in Dublin. Now, after October 1882, you'll find you had to join as a constable. Then the next rank was acting sergeant, sergeant. There was only one rank of head constable, and a sub-inspector becomes a district inspector. Now, the man responsible for organising the police and setting up the first police depot was Thomas Drummond, the Under-Secretary, and he's buried also in Mount Jerome. And I said the general officers commanding the force at the time were ex-army officers. He was very lucky. The famous Trent, he was in a shipwreck that went down. He threw a bottle into the water. Eventually, he was saved, and the bottle was handed back to him some years ago. He just buried in Mount Jerome, next to the chapel, up against the wall. And there was another officer I was looking for years, and he's actually buried with him. He made his funeral arrangements. He had no other relatives in the country, and he's actually buried inside there with him, Colonel Roberts. J.B. Priestley, the writer, is connected, again buried in Mount Jerome. This is an ancestor of his, Thomas Priestley, and he's buried in the same row as the other peace preservation fellows. That's his headstone there. Now, after 1842, when the depot was formed, it was the only cadet police force, trained cadet police force in the world. So they picked up all the top jobs as chief constables all over the place. But even before that, Anthony Thomas de Fry, whose uncle did a line with Jane Austen, chief constable, he was the first appointed chief constable in the county constabulary in England, which was started in 1838. Then the RIC had a list brought out every 6 months, a biannual list. It shows the packing order of the RIC. It begins in 1841, and 1840, and it goes up to 1921, July 1921. Now, for the higher ranks, it shows where all the sub-inspectors are all based, when all the different moves that they made through the ranks. Then after that, you have the sergeant in charge of every station is in it. Those who had medals during the war. It's a great way to track a person above the rank of sergeant. And to accommodations at courts and things like that, that's all mentioned in it. But it's a great way to find out. You can trace an officer no problem from that time. Now, the man responsible for putting it together was John Monsell, born in 1802, and he died in 1879. He knew everyone who had passed through the RIC up to 1879, and his son, a sub-inspector, took it over afterwards. Just what's on the service record, to answer the other gentleman's question there, we'll go, what has survived? On every RIC man, there was a full file, and for there's only four of the sample files have survived, and they're in the Public Records Office in Kew. And you would cry if you had someone in the RIC and the little pieces you got and what you could have got. There's a physical description of the person, sketch of the person. There's all the forms that went with him when he joined. There's certificates of baptism before 1864. There's marriage certificate, baptism or birth certificates of the children, and all the promotions. His arithmetic test, all those toes, and the results of all those, they're all in it, and only four have four sample files. What happened was, when the RIC were disbanded in 1922, the full files were all were left in Dublin Castle, taken to the London office. The person's done a thesis on it, and by 1939, they were only interested at that stage in holding on to who went on pension. And the deal in the treaty was that those serving at the time of disbandment were given British pensions by the Paymaster General in England, but those in Ireland who could prove afterwards to the Irish government that they supported the cause in some way qualified for pensions. And so they were stripping out as the RIC were all dying off, but they took out all the other information, just only kept the basic thing in it. They were all intact up to 1939 in Ealing, where the studio is, and pulped after that. So it's an absolute shame what has gone. But just what's on the service record is the register as such. And in the register, you get the registered number. Now, the beauty about doing a family tree is that you can stick a number on your guy. And I'm putting the whole lot in the database at the moment, but what I never bargained for was, when I put him on the database and see number 32657, what applied to him in the Phoenix Park Depot applied to, say, probably 100 more to pass through at the same time. If he's in a class, you have everybody else got in a class. And nowadays with digital, you can just pull them out. People say to me, my grandfather's in the RIC, but he's retired. He's still the same person. It's the same face. But you stick his number on him, and he lines up with all those in the same class. Now, he'd have had the same instructors, and he'd have gone through the same regime at the time. So in blocks, you can get... I've 10,000 photographs got from relatives over the last 20 years. And a lot of that was followed by asking the question, have you got a photograph? Oh, yeah, it's only his wedding photograph. The same person. It doesn't matter what age it's in, but it's the same. Now, the service record's only as good as the information of what happened to him in the service. I'm anxious to know that I can finish my inquiries with him, say, where is he now? Where's he buried? And you'll find out other stories of people, oh, there's a photograph somewhere else. It eventually comes in, and now I'm putting on the records like that, and at the very end of it, I'm tagging the name and address of a descendant. And I can say to you that there's somebody else out there is looking for him. It mightn't happen today, but it's happening on, the more I put on a regular basis, that people are tracing the same people. And again, they have a unique sequential number, which makes a difference to everything else. And then you can say where other... Now, there's Christian name, surname is on the service record. This is on the register now that has survived. The original is in Kew. There's a copy in the Garda Museum, in the Public Records Office in Northern Ireland, and the National Archives have it here in Bishop Street. The age when he was appointed, and I mentioned, if he was 18, there's a great chance it's more than likely his father was in it. Or if his height is only 5'8", or else he ended up in the mounted section, the shorter guys, because that's the way they distribute the post in the RIC. The post was sent out by a dispatcher. It was signed off. I see some of the documents that they had. It was signed off, and they had to qualify to say that they did read it at the time. And that's how the correspondence was all got. And they used the shorter guys, obviously, in the horse to do it. You had the native county. Now, there are two questions in that. There's native county and the county in which connected. So if a person, say, from Galway, he could have another brother serving above in Mayo. So that's the second county, that's where that applies. Now, when it comes down to the person recommending him, it said, if this was born in Galway, joined in Mayo, you will find, and it's only recently I found out this, you won't find anybody recommending him in Galway, but wherever he went to join, you'll find the officer there, that the place where he joined, and not the place of his birth. That has thrown some people, it's thrown me for years, but no, I eventually got to grips because that kind of pattern is emerging. The religion is in it. Some of them you see, there's a line to Protestant, taking the soup, become Catholic, nearly always to get married. Or what they call a person who goes the other way around, they call them dippers. They go and dip into another religion. I'm only able to find that out too recently. Now, the wife's native county is in it, and invariably, when you look at the record, you'll find out that this guy gets married. It's just after 7-year service. It was a dismissible offence not to report the marriage. And in the very early days, it was relaxed at the very end when they needed him. But a lot of guys were dismissed as a result of it. Or they're still writing bold and red all over the thing anyway, and this is the proper date that it was reported. You get the wife's native county, who, recommended by a magistrate, a GP, Protestant clergyman, they're usually, when they are local, a sub-inspector would... a constabulary district at the time would take up about 2 or 3 parishes. So you're there or thereabouts to find out where the person is from. His trade of calling, previous occupation. All the TANs you'll find ex-soldier on it, and you'll also find previous occupations, even acrobats, believe it or not. I'll just show you a list when it comes to them at the end. They're hilarious, and they're even funnier still, the reason that the excuses they live to get out. The date of appointment and reappointment. You'll find a lot of them would fail the medical examination and they would be reappointed. Declared unfit by surgeon, but come back a month later, stretch the height or something like that and go back in. And the other ones who are reappointed are those who went off to the First World War. You'll find a list in the Irish Guards and enlisted on such a date, names the regiment, and then you see him coming back in again. If a person was forced out, say, or he wasn't able to get in the first time, with loss of service will be on it for pension purposes. But if a person comes back in with benefit of service, 3 years in RIC, 4 years in Army, that'll all be, it made a huge difference to their pension. The counties to which they're allocated, unfortunately, it's only the county that's given on the service record. And funnily enough, there seems to be a county, whatever, They keep on putting down Drogheda, the Constable County. Dates of promotions and reductions. And the reason for the reduction is also comes up in the fine part of it afterwards. Marks of distinction, favourable records. Now, there was a reward system in the RIC. At the very early days, you got what they call a chevron. And if you got 3 chevrons, the 3 chevrons, you get money at the end of your service to buy back that chevron. Or also, if you had 3 chevrons, you got the constabulary medal, the very early constabulary medals. And that's, then there was a reward fund. And the RIC men have been fined right, left and centre, and very substantial fines. And the very early stages, 10 shillings, 10 shillings, 20 shillings, 30 shillings, and huge amounts altogether. But all that money was put back into the reward fund. And the reward fund paid the rewards out of that. So much so that it generated so much money that they've had to publish what they call the half-yearly sheet. It started off as a half-yearly sheet. And some of them have survived from 1848 up to 1882, but what it says is that why he was fined, usually drink-related. And even thinking about drinking early, you were fined. And there's so many different ways. It's a science in itself to find out all the different ways about drinking that are in it. And then there's the rewards for the chasing after runaway horses, all this type of stuff. But they balanced the books that way with it. They eventually came a surplus through the force, but there's some hilarious reading in it. And the beauty about it, having a unique sequential number, when you're looking at those records, you can pick your guy out straight away because the registered number is on it. The rewards for the officers are very flowery altogether. You know, they're really that he was nearly at death's door by the time he caught up with him and this type of thing, and he fought him off with 2 guns bare face and all this kind of stuff. But it happened. He was only looking for promotion later on. You'll see that when he goes for interview, he uses all those. Unfavourable records, fines and admonitions, as I said, they're well recorded, but the actual files relating to those do not exist. They were kept in the local county constabulary headquarters, do not exist. The type of injury that a person got, there's one man there I see got a bang over the head, and just looking at his file, Joseph Leddy. And in 1932, when he was a pensioner, a TD, they had a sparring match at the door anyway. It ended up the XRA, or the TD at the time, Reynolds, said to him that he was going to take his pension off him. And it got worse than that. He came out and shot the TD dead. And he shot the guard dead. And the guard ended up on the Roll of Honour. And that was 1932, and so you could show what feelings were even still at that time. And the same RIC man got a bang in the head on his file. Just I have it in front of me here. I just only got it the other day when I heard the story. But you know, there's reasons for everything, but it heated argument, and the guard was not on the official monument. He's only been recognised in the last few years. But again, that's other things happening behind the scene. Died, the probable cause if he left, and if he resigned, why? Now, the very end column says connected in county, CONTD is on it. And that shows that if you had that's for fear a person could attempt to get back in. And that they knew as much information about him. Also shows that he could have a brother serving in another county, that he definitely would not be serving there, or the home county, or the wife's county. So it limited his possibilities. Another thing too is the difference between the RIC leaving and coming back is that the DMP men, when they came back, were given a new number. The RIC men didn't. You were left out, but you resumed your old number. But what they did was they cut out your service for pension purposes. Now, all these fines, if you see a fellow on it, you guarantee they got a reduced pension, and it always happened. They affected your pension, and that's the way they used them afterwards. And in fact, when they came to be disbanded, there's what you see on the end of the record, TS Treasury sheet. There's these big sheets where they were all paid off. And you see some of them with remarkably low pensions. And I saw, and all the guys who were in the station, shows all the station they were in. But there's one I came across, and someone left a disciplinary file inside it. And this had two major fines, and his pension was lower than the others. And the disciplinary fine was threatening to strike the sergeant. And the second was striking the sergeant. No, just there's a little bit more information on the officers. Their surname, Christian name, the date they were appointed as an officer. Now, there was 2 methods of joining the RIC. You either went in at the lower ranks as a sub-constable and went up through the ranks, or you went in as an officer, as a cadet officer, and if you went in at the lower ranks, you were given a registered number, and that registered number still stayed as an officer. So you can, in the record, you can distinguish who's a cadet because he doesn't have a number. The age that they were appointed, that would be appointed an officer, say after 15 years service, he's 33 years of age. His native county, his religion, if married, the date of the marriage in the wife's native county, the date he was appointed to a constabulary district, any promotions, service in the army, navy, or other public situation. There would be a lot of them that were seconded for service in World War I. That's where that comes in, and gives you the regiment that they were in. Circumstances other than which he left the constabulary: injury, resignation, dismissal, discharge, pension amounts, or an appointment to a foreign police force. Now, just bringing you on to the very interesting temporary constables, or black and tans, and temporary cadets in the Veterans Drivers Division. The first British recruit to the RIC during the Troubles was William Bird, and his number is 70014. Remember, they started number 1 on the 6th of January 1920, 23-year-old gas fitter from Middlesex. A total of 7,464 British recruits. Now, why I call them British recruits rather than black and tans, they were still ordinary RIC men being recruited, other than black and tans. The difference between the black and tan and the others is that the ordinary RIC man, even though he's a British recruit, still got a pension at the end of the day. The black and tan was here, and he was on a renewable contract. The Auxiliaries were the same. They were on a renewal contract. They were on £1 a day. The black and tans were on 10 shillings a day. And the Auxiliaries won. And that was all found. And where were they going to spend it, the Auxiliaries? They hardly go to the local pub. They made an absolute fortune here, so because the Auxiliaries had a yearly contract. And by the time the truce came, just as the truce was coming, they saw the opportunity if things were going to go, they were going to be heading out of the country. They renewed their contract just before the truce was signed, and they were paid up to July 1922. And some of them were in Palestine, had even gone off to Palestine to state, but they actually signed, their disbandment terms were complete. There's a separate book on their disbandment terms to the ordinary RIC, and they made an absolute fortune here, and they couldn't spend it. So much so that they gave them their gratuity, so to speak, in different parts of England to collect it, rather than they having a party here just before they go. The temporary constable recruited, this is the first black and tan, was Christopher Tyndall, 72754, on the 3rd of September 1920, 40-year-old ex-soldier. You can see all the rules are broken. He's no longer 19. They're trained, they're ex-soldiers, but he's from Kildare. 10% of the black and tans are Irish, and roughly 10% of the auxiliaries are Irish. And a lot of those were those who were out of work in England and found a way of getting back home. And you can distinguish the tans from the British recruits because the others are going through the ordinary process. With the tans on the records, you won't see where they ended up on their record. They were just on contract and they could be moved overnight. And they were sent off from their central station in what they call drafts. And that's all explained by a black and tan who's written Douglas Valder Duff, believe it or not, who is Sir Roger Caseman's godchild. He was a black and tan here. A total of 2,183 temporary constable black and tans recruited you had the RIC Veterans and Drivers Division. Now, for example, Kilmichael, it says so many auxiliaries were killed. One of them was a temporary constable because some of the black and tans, they had to have drivers and the officers weren't doing the driving. So any time the auxiliaries came out, that's why all the confusion is. But where you started on the papers is, and you see how wrong the papers are completely up in a heap. They don't know who's who at the time. But when you know who's on the list and you know the name, you know whether he's a tan literally by the money that they got, and you can distinguish them. And that's why all those killed in Kilmichael were not auxiliaries. One was a tan. Another thing, a very interesting thing I found out was that the drivers, most of the drivers were Irish. And the reason being because they knew where they were going. And they recruited them locally, which is even more of a danger in itself. And it makes an awful lot of sense. It's only the practical side of it. But they're hidden in the numbers. First temporary cadet recruit was Harold Pearson. And they had an auxiliary number. Their records are separate too, and it gives you the regiment that they were in. And a total of 2,263 temporary cadets went into the RIC Veterans Division. Now, just looked at the Auxiliary Division. It was recruited from ex-officers who served in the Great War. Each cadet signed a form of engagement and joined the force. The effect of his contract was that the cadet was bound to serve for 6 months and without further engagement could at his option serve for a further 6 months. but on giving a month's notice was entitled to resign during 6 months of his first engagement. A lot of them signed up for the 12 months straight away, but they were cute enough to when they saw it. No, it suited the government at the time because they weren't going to retraining and starting off looking for officers all over England again. So, and this is the form, this is the conditions. Guaranteed appointment for 12 months, £1 per day, increased to 1 guinea a day. Uniforms of the RIC supplied free. Service dress officers could be worn without badges of rank. Duties consistent in training, cooperating with police and patrol and defence work. Preferential selections for permanent cadetships in the RIC. If they were going to cadetships, come up to 8 first shot at it. And grades of discipline, disability, pension allowances, same as ranks as sergeant. Now, the first ones that were allocated in Dublin here, the biggest bush was their headquarters, and if you read the papers of the time, they're called sergeants. And you see they're rounding up IRA around the Dublin mountains and that type of thing. And they're acting on intelligence. They had great intelligence when they started, but they found themselves within months, all that intelligence when the IRA caught on what was going on, that all dried up. So the auxiliaries go off on their own, and they have what they call defensive barrack sergeants with them. They got all these fortified buildings around the country, and they occupy those. They're all nearly in castles. Macroom Castle being one of several castles. I've just a presentation on all the castles that they were in, and they form what they call companies. And the only logic we'll explain in a book to anybody will be, just when I'm almost there, is that just show the companies that were formed and when the companies, when they go from one place to the other, because they're swapping between all over the place. And eventually you can pin down who did who to what. That's for another day for somebody else to find out, but I'm anxious just trying to get, if you get the names right, everybody has a name. It's like, with all these commemorations coming up, I'm anxious to know who exactly was in the GPO. And it's the same with the towns. Everybody wants to know who did what, but things like that. This is an application form they would have filled up. Now, this thing about auxiliaries and TANs all being left out of jails in England, I've yet to find any record of it. But I have found RIC men, black and TANs, auxiliaries, afterwards in the records, losing their pensions on account of being convicted of some crime, even 5 and 6 years onwards. And just the form that would have been complete. The name of the unit, the regiment they were in before, their age, height, physical defect, military record. There was a background check done on them with the War Department, and at very short notice, and I'll just come to one there shortly. The date they enlisted in the service, any decorations mentioned, the rank on their discharge, occupation prior to enlistment, and they certified that. Now, all this must go to Major Fleming, the recruiting officer in Great Scotland Yard. And Major Fleming was a major in the Irish Guards who served as a county inspector in the RIC. His grandfather was Thomas Fleming, who set up the Phoenix Park Depot, the first officer in the depot, and his son was an officer. So there was a tradition from 1842 up to 1922 to one place setting up the depot, so the last guy bringing in the TANs. And it went to him, and just to look at some of the Irish, out of a total of 2,263 of the auxies, I've identified so far 126 out of 1,427 were Irish. And when you see all these fancy countries like Arabia and all that, you'll find that their sons are British Army officers serving in all those countries and not necessarily being... and then of that 126, Dublin comes first on the list. It's like the song contest, and Antrim, Belfast, populated areas. So. And no, the auxies were completely cocky in what they were doing. They were here on huge money. They were occupying castles. They were drinking and a law unto themselves. And then even so much so that their rank structure that they had a drink called after every rank. They called it Colonel Steady Drink, Economy Blend the Adjutant, Hasty but Good, the Platoon Commander, and Every Man's Drink, next guy's spirit. They published a book when they were here, a magazine, at gunpoint down in Limerick. And it's called The Bog Trotter. And some of this is the type of information kind of coming out of it. Short to suit the quartermaster, full-bodied and good. G Company, not recommended for rebels. This recruiting officers, complete list of recruiting officers where they were recruited in England. And what would be a fantastic study to see what happened to these guys before and after. And but the majority were recruited in Scotland Yard. And Major Fleming was the guy recruiting them. Now, the Phoenix Park Depot, as I said, was set up in 1842, and again, it was the only cadet trained police force in the world. So the RIC were responsible for setting up every single police force in the colonies, and those who were set up had to do a period of training, the officers. So, and they wore their uniforms, distinctive foreign police uniforms, in Dublin, going to court, learning the court system here. That's a snuff box that was passed around the depot. It's now on Prince Philip's desk, I'm told, that the PSNI had in their place. But it goes back to the time of Waterloo, and that was in the depot inscription. Some of the officers. Just the depot staff, it's a huge organisation, and that's the amount of different rank structures. So if you have an ancestor with any of those other terms on it, they were connected to the depot. Now, you will not find the black and tan before 72096 on the, this is when they start coming, and with the Inspector General's order will be on their service record, as distinct from the guy going before the local district inspector, or recommended by the local district Inspector General's order will be on it, and the date after will be 23rd of July 1920. And then with the officers, some of the officers then, to confuse the situation more, some auxiliaries that came in became cadets in the RIC, and some RIC officers went off with the auxiliaries. So that'll tell you what confusion, and the job the papers even had to keep up with them. This is Thomas Fleming, the grandfather of Major Fleming, and he's buried in Mount Jerome along the same row as Priestley and all the others. And he ran away to join the army, and this is his son, and that's Thomas Fleming there. Or the still friend, this guy who brought in the Black Tans recruit in London. That's him at the RDS. That's him there on the right-hand side, in London with some of the recruits. And that's one of the, how I came across that was that someone was selling a set of medals, and it also had the War Office inquiry to check if any background problems. And that was done on all of them. This is one of the first head constables that was in the depot. And just holding it up. Now, just the various obstacles of it to the RIC that came across was obviously the rising of 1848, and that's now a national monument. And for anybody who had any RIC connection with that, who came under fire, there is actually a complete list of all those who came under fire and exactly what compensation they got. And I gave to people setting up that, and it's actually have it displayed on the wall. Every fellow came under fire in that house. The RIC were surrounded and kept inside in it. And one officer, the officer who had relieved him, got the Constabulary Medal for bravery, and the fellow who was relieved also got the medal. And there was a big argument with them in the papers after who should have got the first one and all this type of thing, but things haven't changed. And that's Trent, Cox and Trent. And that came from one of the Young Irelanders trials at the time. Someone sketched, that ended up in the States, sketched everybody who was at the trial at the time. Everyone bar the judge and the two officers are sketched. The Irish Constabulary and the London Metropolitan Police then set up the Mounted Staff Corps, who become the military police, the forerunners of the military police, to go off to the Crimea, and that's where the scarlet uniform comes from. You can see that's some of the bright uniforms in the Crimea. The Phoenix Park then had the mounted troop, and you can see the man with his hands folded there near the centre. He survived the charge of the Light Brigade. He's the guy afterwards who sets up the mounted troop in Phoenix Park. And he's in that photograph. And John Duffy, the former curator of the Garda Museum, that's him standing on his grave there above in Glasnevin. We found it there some years ago, unmarked. Now, the station badge from 1867 on has Royal Irish Constabulary, and that's the Victorian Crown up to 1900. And after 1900, it has the Edwardian Crown from 1900 up to 1922. And the badging, the cap badges, the collar badges, all change with the crown changes. So that's, and this little pillbox cap, that was always the one before 1900. The peak cap came in after 1900. This is the firing party in Tala, Dominic Burke. He got the Constabulary Medal too for suppressing the rising there. And he's the gentleman on the right with the sideburns. And that's him there later on. In fact, this is a photograph that was in the PS9 Museum or the RUC Museum for ages, and they were trying to identify it, and the sideburns again. And that's him in 1897. And he's a patch over the eye. He's one of Cusacks, as the Minister mentioned earlier on today, one of Cusack's students, Thomas St. George McCarthy, who was buried in the Pauper's grave out in Dean's Grange. And for the centenary of the GA, we got his grave marked. That's what was there before it. And that's the Garda Commissioner and Representative from the North and the President of the GA marking his grave. He played rugby for Ireland and never got a cap, the most unlucky man I've ever come across. And that's, this is the very first guard. Again, the guard numbers, they're up to, I think, number 35,000 at the moment. But he's an extraordinary character. And guard number 2 did everything right, kept his head down, his mouth shut, got promoted, everything right. But guard number 2 did everything wrong. When I came across him, I was walking inside in Cork City, and a person said to me, there's a fellow above in the nursing home, he said. His father was the first guard. And I said, it's a tall order, what was his name? So I checked the register, and it was Patrick Joseph Kerrigan. And so I called up to him, and he showed me this photograph. He's in Irish Guards uniform in World War I. And I said, what happened to your father? I don't know, I said. Where is he? When did he die? He said, he died in the 40s, somewhere in New York, he says, like that. I have cousins over there. And so I went from there anyway, and he told me that he'd been in the RIC, been Irish Guards, he was also in the Irish Army, and he was in the Dublin Metropolitan Police. So then he told me that his father had skipped and took off, went off to America, and had a second family in the States. So he showed me another photograph with himself, with a son of the other family in the States, with a sister who would come home looking, trying to trace his relatives. And he said, for that photograph to be taken was amazing, because my sister never got photographed with anybody. So, by coincidence, the son of the Garda was in the nursing home, had a daughter living in California, and who was married to a Mexican. So the great-grandchildren, the first Garda, half Mexican triplets. And they weren't baptised at the time, so he was going to go for the baptism. So he said, how will we track down them in the States? Luckily enough, I knew someone who had a complete list of telephone numbers in New York State, and he had an address, Rosemary Circle in Albany. I got the number anyway, and he dialed it. He got through to a cousin, and we got a forwarding address for the son, his half-brother in California. So he said, what will I do? So I said, send a letter and get him in contact with your sister in California. Did that anyway. Now, the letter arrived at the sorting office, and someone in the sorting office knew that this guy was playing golf next Sunday, thinking it was him, and he gave him the letter. And he was living 15 minutes away from the man's daughter. So the two of them went over. The two of them met up at the christening, photographed for the first time. They're absolutely nearly identical twins at this stage. And but a funny thing afterward, the story here was that guard number 1's son and guard number 2's son used to meet above in Drogheda. And guard number 2 son was going cocky as hell, and my father was the most senior guard, but all your man used to was, he can never be number 1. And but they met up, and I found his grave, and I put a cap edge on it. Yeah. This is Padraig Pearse's house, and the annex to the side is a snooker room. The reason being the the Inspector General of the RIC, Colonel Neville Chamberlain, founded a game of snooker, and that's the reason it was built on. He was living that. He's actually signed the census in 1901, and he's the Inspector General of the RIC. Just another aside, just 2 revolvers that Custer had with him were 2 RIC revolvers. Someone told me when I told him about that, they said he'd be better off with a pair of runners. There's a connection with the RIC and Napoleon Bonaparte. Bram Stoker, the Garda Museum will be moving into Dublin, a different person in Dublin Castle, where actually Bram Stoker worked, and his maternal grandfather was an RIC man. There's also a connection to Oscar Wilde. This is some RIC men who were up in Toronto in Canada. I spoke to Peter Jennings years ago, his ancestors in the RIC, Amanda Sullivan's in the RIC. Sir Henry Arthur Blake, Governor of Newfoundland, and if you have any Chinese money at the moment, or outside the Hong Kong flag, there's a flower called after him, Bohinia Blakeiana. He's buried below in Cove, buried in Youghal under 4 yew trees planted by Sir Walter Raleigh. That's the famous Listowel mutiny where the RIC threw off the tunic. That's one of the recruits who went on to become a bishop. Douglas Hyde's brother was an RIC man. Francis McCoppin was mayor of San Francisco. and these were the tans. William Hill, the bookmaker, was a black and tan in Mallow. Stanley Holloway was a black and tan here. And finally, this is Tyne O'Mahony. He was manager of the Irish Times, lost a leg, a printing press fell in it. He fought in World War I. And this is his son, Dave Allen. Now, I know where he gets his humour, because he went to a fancy dress party with one leg dressed as a toffee apple. And just, I'll wrap up on this last guy. He's the most extraordinary character I've come across, Douglas Valder Duff. He's Sir Roger Caseman's godchild, just only for starters. He was shipwrecked in World War I, the only survivor. The other body was taken to France. He was interrogated at the time, thought they were up to something. That's where the ship is at the moment. You actually go on the internet and find the ship. This is the grave of the other body that was found in it. That's commemoration in London to all those killed. This is his father with him. He missed his father's funeral, but the father only wanted to be buried at sea. So he got the father cremated. He made this little boat with an engine on it, so sent it up the Thames with a bomb net and blew up the father. So, this is, when he's in Galway, he talks about Lord Haw throwing him overboard above in Galway. He also gives an account of going to rescue Michael Collins in Dublin. And this is him as second in command of the Palestine Police in Jerusalem. He saved the life of the last president, and he has all the family has all the correspondence to match, of Italy. He also saved Haile Selassie's life, an assassination attempt on him. He became a spy. He's like in World War II, and he ends up like Captain Birdseye.